All right, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome today to our LabKey webinar. As you know, earlier this year, we launched the initial release of our latest product, LabKey Sample Manager, and today we'll be showing you how Sample Manager can be used amongst other features to track samples. I'm Jason Ledley, Director of Business Operations based in the UK, and joining me for the demo today from Seattle is our very own Director of User Education, Steve Hansen.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Steve. So at this point, I'm going to turn my video off because I figure that the slides are far more interesting to see than my face. And let's get into the slides. Okay, just before we get into some of the detail around LabKey Sample Manager, I wanted to just provide take a second to provide an overview of what Sample Manager is and some of the really key benefits and some of the values. Firstly, in designing and developing the product, we undertook many hours of numerous consultations with different laboratories and different scientists and different laboratory managers, and we really embraced the insight to create different user personas to deliver a robust resource that represents what we think is real world laboratory needs and workflow. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Above all, though, Sample Manager is intended to be flexible. Flexibility is a very key theme for LabKey Sample Manager. In fact, uniquely, the product is not confined to managing samples just in the biomedical and life science area. Sample Manager can actually be used to manage virtually any sample type. And it's also very easily scaled for laboratories of different sizes and for those with different data capture needs. So flexibility is a theme that we'll return to time and again. In those consultations, we heard that adoption of new laboratory tools can often be a barrier. And so we're offering LabKey Sample Manager in the cloud only. And this really does eliminate the need for internal IT and technical input, making it very easy then to adopt and embrace within your place of work. When we think about LabKey Sample Manager, there are really three key areas which stand out and make it unique in many ways. Firstly, there's the sample tracking, of course, where we'll be spending most of our time today, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next slide. But secondly, we have data integration, allowing users to fully integrate numerous experimental assay data sets, as well as metadata at the sample level. And thirdly, we have a task-based workflow feature, which helps users and laboratory leaders to track operational laboratory tasks. So really everyone across the laboratory can take advantage of LabKey Sample Manager. We'll be covering the data integration and workflow features in greater detail in other subsequent webinars, so do look out for more details on them in due course. But for today, we're going to be focusing primarily on the sample tracking capabilities. Now, in order to cater for a wide range of user needs and different data types, the sample tracking component offers a number of key features, typically the ability to capture and track sample type, so users can organize samples that are the same, things like blood, urine, and serum, etc. Sample source, so users can tag the physical origins of the sample. Sample lineage, so users can visualize and interrogate sample parentage and their derivations. And users can use the timeline feature to track things like chain of custody of a sample from when it's first registered, and create unique sample IDs using either a custom string or the built-in automated sample ID generator. And last but not least, to track the processing of samples through a sequence of operational tasks using the inbuilt workflow tool, for example, so that both users and laboratory managers can both efficiently track and measure work within their workspace. Now, importantly, the order of this workflow is not in any way fixed. Again, speaking back to the flexibility of the platform, users have a complete choice as to which data types they capture and track. And the UI can be configured to support any variation of your preferred workflow. So with that background, let's dive into the platform and take a closer look at it. And I'll hand over to Steve very shortly to show us through the demo. Today, we'll be using the chat if you have questions. And periodically throughout the demonstration, hopefully we'll have a chance to address some of those questions. But if you do have questions, feel free to send them across and we'll get through as many of those as we possibly can. Okay.
Great. Great, thanks, Jason. Here, let me share my screen. Can you hear me out there?
We can.
Great, thank you much. Well, again, I'm Steve Hansen. I'm the Director of User Education here at LabKey, and I'm going to show you around Sample Manager. This is a instance of the Sample Manager that it's actually public. You can see it online. I'll send you a link shortly to it if you want to look around. We put our own data into it, or I put my own data into it. As Jason mentioned, this is the homepage of Sample Manager, and as Jason mentioned, the homepage really highlights the three big dimensions, if you like, of the data in the system. We have here the samples. This is like a summary view of all the assets that I have, sample assets I have in my lab. This panel here on the left is all of the workflow items. These are all the jobs and tasks that have been applied to these samples. And third, this panel gives me an overview of all the assay data that I've imported and integrated into the system. We're really gonna focus, we could really drill into any of these three areas and learn a lot, but today we're gonna really focus on sample tracking. So I'm gonna drill into this panel here, and it'll unfold into more and more detail about really the stories, the narratives around these samples and all the things that we've been doing to them in our lab. Again, this is a fake lab, it's all fake data, I invented it, but. So first, let's drill in a little bit more. I mean, notice here I've got 6 sample types. A sample type is really how LabKey understands a set of samples. You define, also I really want to stress, you define what the sample types are when you're working with Sample Manager. I had this data already, encoded as Excel files and tab separated value files, and I told LabKey how to capture these samples. I defined all the fields in these, all of the columns and whatnot. So let's look at one of these in particular, the blood samples. When you drill into the blood samples, you'll see a table, a grid. Again, I defined all of the columns in this grid. They were part of an Excel file. And actually at the end of the demo, I'm going to show you how to do that. How do you capture a whole new set of samples that you haven't before? Notice this grid gives me, again, a pretty high level overview of what's in here. I know that from these numbers here, there's 501 blood samples, 501 blood vials. I'm looking at 20 of them right now. If I want to kind of page through these, I can surf through in that kind of way if I want to look for a particular sample. Or, if I wanted to ask a question of this grid, I could do it here with this combo box tool here. So suppose I want to know, I'm trying to complete project X. And so I want to know, well, what samples are part of project X? Which samples are in good shape? I don't want the column problem with tube to be true. I want it to be false. So samples that are in good shape, that are part of project X, and that aren't exhausted yet. Notice I have a volume column I've defined here. Some of these samples still have some life in them, like this one's got 90 milliliters left of it. This one doesn't. He's exhausted. He has 0 milliliters left. So I can do that really quickly just by using the combo box here. I'm going to say I want all of the samples that are part of project X. That's going to break. So notice my grid has already come down to 154. And I also want problem with tube to be false. And I want the milliliters to be, suppose I'm doing a set of experiments that might take a fair amount of sample to complete, I want vials that have at least 25 milliliters left in them. So I'm down to 42 candidates that I can work with to help complete my Project X work. And, this is a really nice grid to have. Like I want to, consult this perhaps later on as I go. There's a couple of ways I could get back to this grid. I could export it. And there's a number of different formats here. I could, export an Excel file like right here and, send this off to Jason, my collaborator, and say, this is what we've got to work with for this project. But I could also use the URL itself, actually. This URL, if you read it, it looks like perhaps gibberish, but if you really look at it, it actually makes perfect sense. Notice at the end here, it says the volume must be greater than 25. All of those conditions are packed into that URL. And that's a live URL I can use. I'm actually going to put it in the chat right now. I think you should all get to see this. And then you'll be able to see that grid. And this is also, if you click that URL, you're going to, it's going to be your route into this sample area that we've built up. Before I keep going, I'm going to go into some more detailed views here. Anything I'm missing or you want me to mention, Jason, or any chat question came up, maybe I should answer before I keep going?
We're all good right now, Steve.
All right, let's keep going. I'm going to clear out these filters on the grid. We're back to our full grid of 501 samples. So let's drill in a little bit more. I'm going to, oh, by the way, I should also say up here at the top, this set of tabs, this will keep appearing, you'll see in the UI. This is just another quick way to look at all my other samples, like my DNA samples, my plasma samples, etc. Let's go back to my blood sample and let's look at one in particular. I'm going to look at blood sample 1500. This is a detailed view of just this sample. And notice these tabs here, there's a lineage, an assay, job. These are all different facets of the story that's been built up around this sample. I'm just going to go through these, but look at the overview tab here. We have sort of the base properties of the sample. These are the things that I defined in part of that grid. So we know it's part of Project Y. We know there's nothing left of it. It's 0 milliliters. We know it's a baseline examination blood draw for some study. We know who brought it into our lab. Hannah did, etc. Also, if we scroll down, we can see more details emerging. These are all of the different sources for this blood sample. We know that it came from Lab 9, and there's some details about Lab 9 here. We know that it's also came from a subject named Subject 73, and she's a female. Her primary language is Bulgarian, etc. So that's just the first tab, looking at the details here. If I look at the lineage tab, a lot of that information is really represented to me, but in this more graphical format. What this panel here is telling me is it's giving me a graphical view of the lineage or parentage around this sample. It's got both parents and children. The parents are those sources that we saw earlier. Here's that study, here's that subject, and the lab that it originated from. And you can see the details are popping up as I click through the graph over here on the right. Oh, excuse me. There is the original blood sample. This is kind of the center of this graph, blood 1500 and its details. But we also know a lot's happened downstream from this sample. Here is the PBMC vials that were generated from it. And assays were run on those as well. And those in turn turned into DNA samples. And assays were run on those in turn. So there's a whole chandelier of samples and assays that's being shown to me here. Those assays I mentioned, here they are. The particular blood vial, 1500, has had 3 different assays run on it. A blood count assay, complete blood count, that's what CBC stands for. a chemistry assay, and a nutrients assay. And these are the actual data rows that came out of those assay runs. There's also a number of jobs that this sample's been wrapped up in. Two of them, there's a blood analysis suite back from June, which I ran. And there was a blood analysis suite from July, which Molly ran. They're both complete, those two jobs. And that probably, it explains why there's nothing left of this file. It's down to 0. All of that stuff, all of that history is encoded here on the final tab, the timeline. Everything that we did to this sample has left a little fingerprint, a little story element on that timeline. So the first thing that happened to it is it was registered. I brought it into the system way back in May 19th at noon. I immediately associated some assay results with it. Actually, I mean, in many ways, this is probably not realistic. We probably should have put a job here first, but this is just an artifact of the fact that this is kind of fake data we invented. But each one of those assays has details associated with it. If I wanted to click in to see that assay data, I could do it here on this events details panel. And I also know that these assay data were imported on May 19th. Then in June, we decided to wrap it up inside of a job. We called it the blood analysis suite. And here are the details for that. I owned that job. I created that job. And then there was even a second job that was added to it. Molly did an assay on it. Here are the results from that assay. This is Molly finishing her job. It took me apparently 2 months to complete my job. And also, Molly had the foresight here to decrement the volume. She said, oh, we went from 5 milliliters to 0. So we have nothing left of this sample. So that should give you a sense of, how we track samples and also track chain of custody and really kind of leave footprints behind whenever you're working with a sample. That's just my quick browsing I'm sort of in browsing mode here. I've noticed I haven't really done anything yet with a sample. I've just sort of looked around to give you a sense of how it's all laid out. Any questions or anything from the chat, Jason?
There is one, and you partly covered this,
Yeah.
Steve, and it's how can you track volume remaining if users are taking samples, making aliquots, and using volume?
Yeah. Well, right now you just do it manually. You can just, we can just go and show you how it's done. I had the forethought to put a volume column here in my sample tracking. So if I go to blood 1499, I can just edit this. So suppose I run an assay on this and I use up 5 milliliters, I can decrement that down to 45 milliliters left. When I save it, you'll see the timeline knows it. That way down here is that decrement. Now, so we don't really have like automatic enforcement of volume right now, but as you'll see when what I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually add a sample and build a job around it. We do give you the ability to have very precisely delineated jobs and tasks around a sample. And one of the tasks that I'm going to apply here is make sure to remember to decrement the volume. Any other questions there before I keep going?
No, that's it for now, Steve. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's actually do something. So what is it like to bring a new blood sample in and start working with it, start building a story around it? Well, there's a number of ways to actually import data into the system. I'm going to import new samples here. And the first way I'm going to do it is I'm going to do it from a file. So I have a pre-existing file I want to work with here. It's just an Excel file. but this could also be a tab separated value file, any sort of tabular format LabKey is able to understand really easily. And just take a look at this file here. I've got the columns that match the data type, the sample type that I'm importing into. And I didn't actually have to write out these columns manually. You're on import time, LabKey will actually offer you a template. If you don't know this, what the shape of the data should be, we give you this little template here to download, which will sort of give you all those column headers. I have done that and filled it out with my data. This is just a standard exam draw. These are 100 milliliter draws. They're going to be additions to Project X, etc. They're normal tube colors. They look good. Notice a couple of things here. Notice I am not including a sample ID. I could give these unique names, and they go right into the systems by that name, by those names. But I'm going to leave it blank, and that's going to prompt the system to actually create a sample ID for me. I've configured the system to just have a naming pattern that I want it to engage. Notice also I'm going to include some source data here. This is the labs that these samples came from, and these are the subjects they came from. I could also put a study here or something. It's any of the sources that I've configured, I could reference here and get some parentage into the system right off the bat. So let's go and point at that file. Actually, let's do a drag and drop style. So this is LabKey interpreting that file. It seems to understand it and knows what I'm up to. So let's import it. What do we end up with? We have 5 new samples, and they're right here. Blood 11068, 11067, etc. And those are the samples that came out of that file. Let's take a look at the details for one of them. Sure enough, there's that lineage starting to be built up. We know that it has 2 parent sources. And as we work with it, if I aliquot it or do some processing on it, the child tier will show up. By the way, I forgot to show you something earlier. You don't have to look at the lineage in this graphical sense. It's, perhaps you want to look at it in more of a grid style. You can do that here, so you can switch to another. It's just basically the same information. It's just displayed more as a grid here. What this is telling me is blood 11068 has 2 parents. Maybe it's a little counterintuitive that the parents should be on the bottom, but that's how this works. And if it had children, I could switch over to the children and see the children as a grid. So that's one way to import blood samples. There's 2 other ways. Let's do it again. Another way to do it is to, just insert, suppose you have, 3 samples that are all sort of the same. You can use this bulk style import. These are standard blood draws. They're all 10 milliliters, let's say. They're part of Project X. They were drawn today. They were received today. They were received by me. Tube colors normal, etc. I could keep going. Now, these 3 samples have been added to a grid sort of in line. It's like in the server itself, in the browser itself. It's not a file source. And notice I also am going to allow LabKey to just generate those IDs for me. Sure enough, there are the 3 samples. And notice that this sample generation style, I'm using an incrementing integer. What I've told LabKey is take the fixed string blood dash and just put an incrementing integer there as I go. That's a pretty simple naming pattern. The system actually lets you do a lot with the naming patterns. I could include all kinds of different elements and build up unique names that way. I could include things like dates, partial dates, project names, even from the data itself. So if I wanted to kind of concatenate a name out of the data rows itself, I could. So I could have easily called this blood dash project dash, excuse me, blood dash project X dash 10 dash something, and whatever I wanted. So there's a lot of flexibility there. And then the third way to enter new samples is just to do it just really manually. I'm going to just add one sample, and this time I'm actually going to give it a proper name. I'm going to call it blood 001, and just do it manually here. It's 100 milliliter standard blood draw. It's for project X. It was entered today, etc. And it's by me. And I could keep going, but I think you get the idea. I could also add some sources here to it if I know them. So why not? I'll add a source. Let's say this is from lab. Actually, let's hold back. Let's do that later. I can take that back. So here's my first manually entered blood sample, and next I'm going to start working with this. I'm going to wrap it up inside of a job, associate some assay data with it. But any questions before I keep going into the next steps here?
Just at this point, Steve, and you use the Excel template, but do you have the ability either from the Excel template or from the user interface itself to add additional fields to capture other variables related to the sample?
Absolutely. So if I wanted to kind of, if I found my current sample grid insufficient, my sample type insufficient, I can absolutely go and edit it. So perhaps, here, I'm going to do it right here. I'm back at my blood sample type. This is the main page for it. It's the whole grid of samples. I can actually just go back into the designer and add fields if I want. Here are the fields that I've defined for it. But yeah, suppose I wanted to add, suppose I didn't really like relying on volume milliliters to track whether a sample's been exhausted or not. I kind of wanted something with a little bit more pop to it, something that really kind of jumps out more. I would add a field called exhausted. And notice I would make it a Boolean. So it would be, it's either true or false, it's either exhausted or not. And then I could prompt people inside of the jobs that I'm going to associate with this sample. If you exhaust the sample, make sure to mark this field. So I'll just keep this field. We'll add it. Any follow up there, Jason? It's a good question.
Oh, that's great, Steve. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's keep going on. Let's keep working with our favorite sample here, 001. Let's, like, what have we learned about it so far? Well, we've got a kind of partially filled out details view here. The sources haven't been added yet. We haven't really brought in any sources yet. So let's do that. Let's just add some stuff to it. We're going to say this came from a lab. And I've configured a whole bunch of labs here. Let's say it came from lab 21. So again, we're starting to build the story around this sample, starting to leave footprints behind. What does the lineage graph look like? Well, we know that it's came from lab 21. There are the details for it again in this more graphical style. Are there any assays? No. Are there any jobs associated? No. The timeline is starting to grow though. I registered the sample. That's what that event is. And I added a source to it. That's what this event is right here. So let's keep going. I'm gonna, I want to start a job with the sample. Suppose the first thing we do in this lab is for project X is we do a blood count assay for it. So I'm gonna select my sample. I could select multiple samples to include in into an assay job, but I'm just going to do one sample here. I'm going to select it and say, start a job from the selected samples. So here I'm going to This is the wizard where I can define the job. I could either just define this job ad hoc, manually, and just sort of give the instructions, you know, as I go. But I've also pre-configured all these job templates to kind of keep enforcement in good shape in the lab. There's a whole bunch of them. I could do PBMC isolation. I could isolate plasma. I'm going to do the blood analysis suite. And this is a series of 3 assays that I've pre-configured. I'm going to give this a name. Let's call this the blood analysis suite for 7/14/2020. Project X. These are just the standard assay suite. And I've also configured some locations in my lab. So I'm going to say, get that sample out of the freezer, the 4 centigrade C freezer. I don't really expect it to be exhausted, so I'm not going to say it's disposed. I'm going to say, put that sample on bench 1 when the job is done. Probably should go back into the deep freeze or something, but I'll say bench 1 for now. I'm going to assign this to myself. I'm not going to notify anybody right now. I am going to have a start date today, end date tomorrow. I'll give myself a day. And it's a pretty quick job, so it's pretty high priority. Here are the templates, the template items that I'd pre-configured. So here's what this job consists of. Get the blood and check the tubes. Take a 1 milliliter aliquot from it. Run the blood count assay. Run the chemistry assay, and run the nutrients assay. It seems like a lot to do with 1 milliliter. Probably should change that in the template, honestly. Here is the sample that I've already added to this job. If I'm like, oh, I need to add more samples, I can actually do that here later on after the fact. And if I have some files I want to associate with this, like maybe a protocol, some more, you know, who knows, some paperwork, whatever, I can drag and drop that into here. So I'm ready to start this job, ready to finish creating it. And here is my job page. And notice it's a details page about this job. And it has its own set of facet tabs. Here's a detailed tab about all the tasks about this job. Here's the samples that are wrapped up in this job. It's just one. The assays, the files, which don't exist yet. I'm just going to work this task. I've got something to do now. Let's do a couple of these subtasks here on this job. First, I'm going to do the first 3. I'm going to check the tubes if they're okay. I'm going to take a 1 milliliter aliquot in my imagination, and then I'm going to run the assay. So let's go over to that sample and start performing things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check the tube, and I'm going to say it looks good. So I'm going to say the tube color is normal, and the comments are looks good. So that's, I already completed 1 task. Second task was to take a aliquot off it. So I've down to 99 milliliters. Third task was to import some assay data. So I'm going to go to the assay subtab here and enter the assay import wizard. Notice assay data can be imported in much the same way as assay data. There's sort of 3 options. I can do it from a file, I can do it from a bulk insert, or I can do it sort of row by row manually. I'm going to do it row by row manually. I'm going to add some metadata to this sample, like this is a demo assay. I'm the person operating the assay. I'm going to use instrument 1. The run date is today, and I might as well do the time. It's 9:30. Hell, it's 9:37. And here is where I'm going to enter the assay data itself. I'm just going to do it manually. Notice they're not especially realistic numbers, but it doesn't matter. Now I've got some assay data associated with this sample. I'm going to go back to, well, let's just go back to my blood samples to find it. Yeah, that's fine. So here is our blood sample 001. And let's kind of take a look at everything that's been happening to it. Here's that lineage graph. Nothing's really changed there. There's that assay data. It's been added to the tab. There's that job data. Oh, I haven't marked myself as complete yet. Let's actually go in there and start knocking off some tasks. Right now, I'm on this task. It's in progress. But I did check the tubes. I'm done with that. Here's that 1 milliliter aliquot. I'm done with that too. And I also ran that assay, uploaded the results. So I'm at step 4 now of this job. So that should be reflected now on the Jobs tab. It's 3 of 5 tasks are completed for this job. And the timeline is starting to fill out in a more realistic way. Here is where I registered that job. I first registered the sample and brought it into the system. Here's where I updated it with some provenance information that it came from lab number 1. Here's the job I built up with it. Now, you could also imagine here that the chain of custody here is a little boring. It's just me. But really, this is a collaboration tool. Really, if this were more realistic, I would have assigned this job to Jason. He would have done all that stuff, and you'd see the chain of custody change in the timeline here. So that should give you a sense of sort of how stories build up and how they're displayed in Sample Manager. Any chat questions or anything, Jason, before I move to the next step here?
There are lots of questions I've been answering in chat, but there's one here. Is it possible to slice the data, to have different views of the same underlying data from within Sample Manager UI?
Well, I can do it to a certain degree with, like my blood grid. I showed you a bit. I can do filters and sorts and searches on this grid. And I can also add things to the grid. You know, we added that exhausted tab, we added the exhausted field and whatnot. Now, there are some other tools that you can go deeper with, but it is really part of really the LabKey server offering. And so I don't really want to get into that too much, but the answer is yes, if you explore one of our more expanded offerings. Did you want to say anything more to that, Jason?
Yeah, I think if that's a conversation with specific requirements, the best way is to take that separate conversation offline and getting back with us at the end of this. But that doesn't necessarily fit within the feature list of Sample Manager. Yeah,
at least not right now. We're always open to your requirements. I mean, it's how we build these things. So please, if you're not seeing something you want to see here, we want to know about it, and we want to build it out for you.
And there is just one other question there, Steve.
Yeah.
If assay data was updated, would that show in the timeline view as well?
Well, yeah, I think it would. I mean, let's try it. I think that sounds pretty fun. Can I may not have configured this assay to be editable. And it looks like I haven't. So I'm a little bit, I don't want to go too far afield, but my sense is yes. If I had configured this assay to be editable and I did edit it, I assume it would show up in the timeline. It's all the timeline is doing is it's tracking the audit log that's underneath the covers, and anytime there's an event, it'll add to it. So yes, but I wish I could show it to you. Any other thoughts there, Jason?
No, I agree. I think you're correct. I think it would. But yeah, that's not part of the demo, but we can have that conversation again separately and offline if you want to see that outside of this web. Sure.
Great. Well, as the final part of the demo, I sort of wanted to show you, well, what's it like to create a brand new sample type. Like we're just starting from scratch. This would be the first thing you'd really do if you were to get your own instance of Sample Manager. And I really also wanted to stress really how broad the capture mechanisms are inside a Sample Manager. It's not just limited to biomedical data. It's not, just limited to vials. You could import tissues. You could import biopsies. You could import tree cuttings. That's what I'm going to do. I built a little tree data set to import. But you could even go hog wild. As I was practicing for this demo, it sparked my imagination. You could do cocktails. You could do beer. You could do any of this stuff. But let's do trees. This is a sample grid I built. And what it represents is a botanist who's gone out into the wild. They've had nice hikes on Mount Rainier and Oak Harbor, and they've found these mother trees that they want to take cuttings from. So our first 3 samples are just trees in the wild. This researcher then took 6 cuttings from those trees and intended them for propagation. And he's encoded the fact that these cuttings came from those mother trees, and he put them in his greenhouses. And then he even went further and he said, let's go crazy and make some hybrids. So he did some grafting out of those cuttings, and those are also reflected here in the data. So what is it like to import this data? How do you get LabKey to do that? Well, I'm gonna create a brand new sample type right here. And I'm gonna call it trees. And they're my cuttings and hybrids. And I'm even going to configure the naming pattern just so that's there. And here are the fields. Here's the area where I would define the fields for this sample type. I'm going to do it again just by drag and drop. And with that, I have the fields that I want to capture. I have a location, a common name, scientific, all that. I'm ready to start grabbing data and importing it. It's empty now, but let's actually import that data. So I'm actually using the same file twice. The first time I used that file, I just did it to sort of take a stamp of the data shape. Now I have the data shape, I have the data capture mechanism called a sample type, and I'm going to actually put data in it. Here's LabKey interpreting that data. And we're ready to go. Let's take a look at what this looks like. What does this hybrid look like? Well, those are the details for it. We know it's in greenhouse 3, et cetera. Here's the lineage for it. It came from 2 mother trees, mother tree 1 and mother tree 3. And in fact, this one's a little different. Actually, this graft I left in the wild. What's happening here is I started with mother tree 3. I took a cutting from it and I actually stuck that cutting onto mother tree 1. So this is kind of a hybrid still out in the wild. These other hybrids are in my greenhouse. This is in greenhouse 3, and it's just somehow some kind of hybrid I built out of cutting 1 and cutting 4, et cetera. So that should give you a sense of sort of how to get going, how to get this process started. And I guess the next thing would be to define some assays. What experiments am I running on this? What kind of jobs am I wrapping these cuttings into, et cetera? That's really all I wanted to show you. And I hope there's enough time to get your questions. Anything, Jason, I should touch on before I hand it back to you?
There is just one. Is it possible to, from within the UI, to order samples for a particular study or a particular use case within the lab?
You know, you know what you could do? First thing I would try is I would create a job template for that.
Exactly that. Yes.
Yeah, I would, let's just do it, here's, let's go to the jobs area. Again, the jobs area is very flexible. These are all the jobs I've created here. Here's my job templates. Let's just create a brand new job template. It's called order samples for shipping.
I guess here, Steve, you
And
could use the
yeah.
notification capability as well, right?
What do you mean, Jason? I just want to make sure.
Notify, you could use the notification element of.
Absolutely. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, here are the tasks, you know, let's review the review the request. It's not really an assay thing. You could also maybe say package the sample. And then maybe let's say confirm delivery. And that's just the template. Now, when I actually use this template, I could use notification. That could notify the people that review the request. I could notify the people that are going to get the sample. So that's a great question. I'd never really thought of this use case, but again, I think it's a great way to show the flexibility of it. Other thoughts, Jason?
Just looking here, nothing we haven't already covered, Steve, to be fair.
Great, super. Well, I'm going to hand it back to you, Jason, and thanks for.
Okay, so let me just screen share once again. So keep the questions coming as we speak, and we'll get to those as quick as we can. But as you can see from Steve's demonstration, even today, Sample Manager already has a very rich feature set of tools, and it's all accessible via a pretty intuitive web-based UI. And you may recall earlier in my introduction, I mentioned that this release is the first iteration of the product, and we're continuing to invest very heavily to build out, to enhance and augment the product with additional new features, as requested really by you and our prospective users. And two examples of that, which users have been asking us for, let me just forward my slide here, are freezer management. And this, of course, will allow users to track and monitor locations, volumes, freeze thaw cycles, and much more. And also barcoding to help users label samples and vessels in a reliable and efficient way. So we're very excited about both of these, and work is firmly underway and on track, and we're aiming to deliver both of these features towards the end of this year. So stay tuned for more information on that. But as Steve said, we're not going to stop here. You know, we welcome your insight, we welcome your feedback on additional tools and functions that you would like to see in your version of LabKey Sample Manager. So please keep them coming. Steve asked me if there was questions. A lot of the questions were coming in around pricing. So I'm sure you'll be interested to see what the pricing structure is. And really, we wanted to make Sample Manager as accessible as we possibly can to laboratories of all different sizes, as I've already mentioned. And to achieve that, we undertook a very thorough review of offerings in the market today and came up with what we think is a highly competitive, but also an incremental pricing framework. As you can see on the slide here, we're offering a single user model at just $125 per month. We have a multi-user model at $450 per month, and even then an unlimited user model, which we're calling professional, priced just at $850 per month. And all of these will be billed on an annual basis. So as I said, it's a pricing matrix really to fit all different types of lab sizes and different requirements. So from here, what next? Well, we would like to invite you to register for a free cloud-hosted trial of LabKey Sample Manager. This will allow you to navigate the UI on your own terms, to get familiar with the structure and the navigation of it, and to upload your own data, to give it context, and to really to see for yourself just how easy and intuitive the product is. But more importantly, I think to witness firsthand the efficiencies it could potentially bring your working environment. It's important to note, you know, we're very invested in delivering a needs met sample tracking tool. It's something that our customers have been asking us to do for many years now. And the idea today was really just to provide you with the highlights of the features, the benefits, and the values that it potentially bring, and to let you know that it's an evolutionary product, that we're building this out over time. And we're very excited, as I mentioned, to to deliver barcoding and freezer management later this year. And really to ask for your help, your feedback, all good, all bad, you know, we are all ears. And we want to do a better job to make sure we build a tool that's appropriate to your requirements. So I think that really brings us to the end of the kind of planned webinar that we have today. I can see, though, that there are some questions coming in. So let me just flick to the chat here. How do I do that? I'm not sure I can while I'm sharing. So one of the questions here, which we can tackle, is this: is an on-premise going to be available, which is not mentioned today, only cloud? Actually, there is an on-premise option, but today we're talking about the cloud-hosted option only, the standalone LabKey Sample Manager. But please, if you're interested in an on-premise install, then please reach out to us. I'll just put my email address back up there, and we'll have that conversation separately to this. Another question here, so is this a separate installation, or can it live together in regular LabKey server? It's a good question. Again, today we were talking about the standalone cloud-hosted version of LabKey Sample Manager. For those customers of ours who are premium customers, LabKey Sample Manager is included in the premium edition that you already subscribe to. But there is, for those community edition users, or for those people who want to use Sample Manager as a standalone, that's what we've been talking about here today. What other questions? I think they're the last remaining questions that we have. We have 6 minutes left, and we can wait. No problem. If there are other questions, please send them through, and we will tackle those as they come. Let's just give that a minute or two. We have many people still here. And also we will be sharing a recording of this with you, so you can refer back to it. And when we distribute this, we will also send to you an email link to where the support documentation sits. But you know, really the next steps for you, we would ask and encourage you to consider is that trial, and it's cloud-based, so there's no install, no IT requirements, and you can put your real data into it to evaluate it, and it's probably the best next thing to make it contextualized for your requirements. Question here, is there a planned webinar for Bartender? Absolutely no doubt that we will focus on that when Bartender is integrated. So yes, stay tuned for more information around that. And then one here, trying to see how the child and parent is linked.
Sure.
You show the tree spreadsheet again.
Sure. Sure. If you give me power, give me the screen share, I'll show you that.
Give you the power. Okay.
All right. Yeah. So what I did, there's actually a couple ways to do this. I did it by using this field column name that LabKey expects. It's this column, material inputs / and then the name of the sample type. So I'm referring, it's sort of like a self-referential field here. It's saying, what these fields is saying is, the mother tree sample has no parents. It's an original parent. It doesn't go any, there's no more parentage here, or it's the beginning of the parentage. This cutting 1, it's saying it came from mother tree 1, and if LabKey, when you want to find that, if you're looking for mother tree 1, it's in the tree's sample type. So that's how I captured that data. Now, suppose you don't want to use this sort of hard to remember reserved name for it. You could just call this parentage. And then I could change my sample type to actually be sensitized to the name parentage. And I would just do it like this. Let's go back to my sample type, my trees, and we're going to manage that sample type. What I would do here is say, I have a parent alias column, and it's called parentage. So this would sort of sensitize the system to look for that column for incoming data. So I hope that helps give you a sense of how I did that.
That's great. Thanks, Steve.
Any other questions out there?
Coming in now, let me read that. Bartender is a very reasonable choice. That's great. I'm glad you like that. And we're looking forward to seeing how that integrates. So lots of positive comments coming through, lots of thank yous coming through, which is great. And
great.
Appreciate the interaction and the feedback. So that's awesome. No questions though, just as yet. So I just wonder, Steve, is it worth going back to showing source a little bit more?
Sure.
It's a fairly new feature that we've introduced. And
yeah, why not? So the source is, they are their own sort of types. They're a lot like sample types. They're just grids, you know, and I just predefined these source types. I defined 3 of them: labs, mice, studies, subjects, and they all have their own properties. You know, the labs have things like an institution they're part of, a primary contact, an email contact. Again, these are all fields I defined. The mice have a little different profile. They have a strain, a date of birth, a supplier, things like that. And so with these source types, they're sort of just waiting to kind of paint. I sort of think of paint or daub on at little information packets or provenance information packets onto one of your samples. So you just have to go to a sample. You can, a couple of ways to do this. You can do it manually like this. I can just add a new sample. In this case, let's say this guy comes from a mouse and it's mouse 2020. You know, that's the manual way to do it. Or I could also do it much the way I did capture the parentage information for trees. So if I have some sources for trees, I could use another reserved field. It's called the data inputs, and let's say labs or something. It has to refer to some existing source table. Or I could also do that thing where I sort of sensitize the system to a column name, and I could say, maybe call the source lab, and then I put my source labs here. So that's how you get that to work. Thanks,
Steve. That's great. So we're at the top of the hour, and just thank you really to everyone who's invested time to be with us today. We really appreciate that. And as I said, there will be more coming to you very shortly. Look out for more information and invites to additional webinars around Sample Manager and other LabKey products as well. Please send your feedback. We're interested in hearing from you. We hope today you found this useful. And thank you very much for joining us. And we will see you very soon at the next LabKey webinar.